So my name is Jackson Parr, and together with Rachel Sodeman, we'll be talking about flood resilience in the Coon Creek Watershed, which is part of our water resources management cohort. There's 4 other master students working on this project for the last 2 years. So what is water resources management? It is a professional master's program within the Nelson Institute at UW-Madison that really works to integrate biological and physical sciences, engineering, law, and social sciences to tackle some water resources issue. One kind of important difference between this and maybe a traditional research master's program is we have a group practicum workshop. So as I said, there's a cohort of 6 of us students working with a real world client. In this project, it is Vernon, Monroe, and La Crosse counties out in the Coon Creek watershed. We are advised by Dr. Eric Booth and have also leaned heavily on our technical advisory committee made up of Paul Jeckham, Dr. Rissman, Dr. Ventura, and Dr. Gottschalk-Druschke. So the Coon Creek watershed, what is it? It is a 90,000 acre watershed in southwest Wisconsin, just a little bit south of La Crosse. It's part of the driftless region, meaning that it was never glaciated, which produced a kind of rolling landscape, if you're familiar with the driftless area. Very steep slopes, high ridges, low valleys. And in the 19th and 20th century, there was really a shift from prairie and forest to cropland and pasture. So as the area became more agricultural intensive, population started to increase. We saw that increase in cropland and pasture taking place. And overall, what that did is it reduced infiltration capacity of the area, which allowed more rainfall to flow into the valley and contributed to severe flooding and erosion throughout the watershed. So moving to the mid-20th century, the United States Erosion Service, now the Soil Conservation Service, created the first watershed demonstration project in the Coon Creek watershed. So Coon Creek is kind of considered the birthplace of watershed demonstration projects in the nation. And what did that project do? It brought in the Civilian Conservation Corps to reforest hill slopes, help install contour strips, terraces, grass waterways, anything that they thought might be able to hold some more water on the landscape so it didn't rush so quickly into the valleys and create these flooding and erosion problems. And what we saw is that essentially that worked. So that figure you see on the lower right shows that the estimated stream discharge was kind of rising into the mid-20th century. Once the Civilian Conservation Corps projects kind of took hold, we saw that decrease in that estimated stream discharge. And that was also helped by a construction of a series of dams in the watershed in the 1960s. So kind of these 2 approaches to improving flood outcomes in the watershed. Over the past few decades, there's been some reversal in those practices, which kind of came to a head in an August 2018 flood event. So heavy rainfall, intense flooding caused mudslides, washouts, road closures. There were emergency evacuations in some of the populated areas. 3 dams within the Coon Creek watershed breached and 2 overtopped. You see one of those breached dams in the lower right hand side of the screen there. And looking at that radar, the Coon Creek watershed is kind of right in the thick of the most severe rainfall. So it was a really devastating event, which kind of encouraged us to look at kind of flood resiliency in the area. We're also aware of climate change impacts. So we expect the severity and frequency of rainfall to increase in the coming decades. So we see there's been an increase in the annual number of days with 1 inch or more of precipitation near the watershed. And then that figure to the right shows that we do expect the severity and frequency of rainfall to increase in the next 30 to 50 years. So that's going to exacerbate a lot of these flooding issues that we've been looking at over the past 2 years. So we're going to focus primarily today on infiltration and land use, which is just one of our project categories. So being an interdisciplinary program, we took a lot of different tacks at looking at flood resiliency. We also looked at the economics of land use change, public perspectives, institutional analyses, and looking at community resilience. So I will pass it right now to Rachel Sodeman, who will talk about infiltration and land use, and then we'll bring it back at the end.
Thanks, Jackson. So our goal was to find ways to increase infiltration in the watershed's landscape, which helps reduce and slow the flow of runoff that causes flood events. And so to do so, we reviewed historic and current trends in land use and land management in the watershed and investigated the effect of land use and land management practices on infiltration. Then we analyzed recent changes in contour strip cropping and also determined the effect of that change and other land use changes had on the watershed storm runoff response and flood peaks. And so first, we want to consider Coon Creek's landscape. So as mentioned in the introduction, the driftless area has unique topography with rolling ridges, steep hill slopes, narrow valleys, and this topography plays a role in runoff generation. And so when a rain event occurs, all water drains into Coon Creek, and the ridges are made up of silt and clay, which have high runoff potentials and low infiltration rates, so it's not incredibly receptive to rain and ultimately causes runoff. This runoff then drains into the steep forested hill slopes, which are covered by a thin soil layer and have fractured bedrock below that allow for higher infiltration rates. But the hill slope steepness moves water quickly into the valley bottom, limiting the infiltration potential. And infiltration rates in the watershed's valley bottom are generally low, and overland flow quickly enters into the stream channel. Thus, the physiographic makeup of the watershed makes it prone to flooding due to low infiltration rates and high runoff. So on the next slide, in the watershed, infiltration rates are inversely related to land use intensity. So forests have high infiltration rates while croplands have lower infiltration rates. The combined effect of land management practices such as cover crops, contour strip cropping, perennial cropping systems, no-till, and buffer strips can help increase infiltration. In the images, you'll see a few examples of these. Contour strips were implemented in the watershed in the conservation project and actually still remain a prominent part of the watershed and show how strips of crops planted in line with the landscape contours really help prevent erosion. Waterways are also a part of the contour strips and sit in between rows and help collect infiltration and cropland runoff. And cover crop provides seasonal cover and help improve soil health and infiltration, but they aren't really commonly used in the watershed. And so after reviewing these effects, on the next slide, our next step was to directly measure infiltration rates in the watershed. To do so, we narrowed our scope to the Rollins Coulee and the headwaters of the watershed, which was the site of 2 of the dam failures in 2018. We selected 3 sites on the ridge with varying land uses of pasture, cropland, and fallow field, and varying land management practices, and conducted our infiltration measurements. For each measurement, we used a double ring infiltrometer, which is filled with water to mimic saturated conditions of a rain event, and we measure the time for a ½ inch drop in water level until we get a consistent rate. It's quite a timely process, but after about 18 measurements throughout the summer, we got to be experts at the process. And on the next slide are the results of our measurements. In the first figure, we're simply comparing the range of infiltration rates for each land type, so corn, alfalfa, waterway, pasture, and fallow field, and we see that grass waterways promote high infiltration rates, while the rest of the land uses are relatively lower. It's also encouraging that 80 to 85-year-old waterways and contour strips from the watershed demo project are still functional and help increase infiltration. And so in the next figure, we're comparing infiltration between annual crops, so corn, alfalfa, and perennial land cover, pasture, waterway, fallow field. And we found that perennial cover has a significantly higher infiltration rates than annual cover. And this is supported from a previous point that perennial cropping systems increase infiltration. And now that we have an idea of the effect of land use and management in the watershed, we sought to track the changes in both land use and land management in the watershed and see how those might impact infiltration, runoff volume, and flood peaks. First, we analyzed the change in contour strip cropping from 2004 to 2018 in the Rollins Coulee watershed, as it was an easy practice to identify from aerial photos and digitize in GIS. So in the image, you see the change from 2004 to 2018, where there's a loss of 536 acres of contour strips in the coulee. And this loss may reduce infiltration capacity of the coulee as contour strips help improve infiltration, as we've noted. However, just looking at contour strips is an incomplete picture of tracking runoff response to the watershed. And so we used the curve number analysis in the coulee to track that change. So curve number is a parameter that measures runoff response of a watershed, and it's dependent on land use, land management, hydraulic condition, and soil conditions. Typically it ranges from 0 to 100, where the higher the curve number means more runoff and vice versa. And you can see an example of each of these in each of these images, where the first shows the factors that determine curve number, and the second illustrates how increased curve number means more runoff. For specific analysis, it's a bit detailed, but here are the data sets that we used. We included the NRCS cropland data layer, the soil survey, and our digitized cropland data strip layers. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see our curve number results. We decided to calculate curve number for the entire coulee and for its ridge. We see an increase in our curve number on the ridge, which leads to greater runoff on the ridge. However, we don't really see much of a change for the curve number in the coulee as a whole. And we also use the SCS curve number method to determine peak discharge at the outlet for the 25, 50, and 100-year floods for a 6 and 24-hour storm. The storm of the 2018 flood was about a 100 to 500-year flood, and we see little difference in peak discharge or runoff volume between the 2 years, but it does give you an idea of the amount of runoff each storm generates. On the next slide, another thing we also explored with the curve number method is the effect that time of concentration has on flood response. And so time of concentration is the time it takes for water to flow from its most remote point to its outlet. Quicker time of concentration and higher flood peak, which we see in a review of peak discharges from a 25-year, 24-hour flood in the neighboring timber coulee by Trimble. Trimble notes how conversion to cropland prior to the soil conservation projects increased flood peaks due to reduced time of concentration, as cropland generates rapid runoff, and how flood peaks then decrease after conservation practices were implemented, as it increased time of concentration by infiltrating more and slowing the flow of runoff. We did something similar in the right figure with the 2018 25-year 24-hour flood, where we adjusted the increase of time of concentration, and it illustrates how this led to a lower flood peak and slower runoff rate. This time of concentration increase can be achieved with effective land management and land use changes that promote infiltration, reduce and slow runoff, and reduce flood peaks. And from that, we were able to come up with a few recommendations, one being to restore and maintain contour strips and native buffer strips, as those help increase infiltration and reduce runoff. A second one being to promote and implement perennial pasture and watershed, and a third being to inform local farmers of the impact that their farming practices have on runoff generation and flooding. So I'll pass it back to Jackson to go over some additional research from our project.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So as I said, this is an interdisciplinary program, and we had a few other project categories that we were not able to fully go in the limited time we had here, but I'm just going to touch on those briefly. So the economic impacts of land use change. It sounds great to just tell all producers that they should put in contour strips and grassed waterways and cover crops, but there's some private costs of doing so. So what are those costs, and are there maybe ways in which we can incentivize those in a way that kind of produces a net benefit to the region? Public perspectives. So there's this idea in emergency management, all disasters are local. So how do people actually experience flooding and flood recovery in the Coon Creek watershed? And what can that experience tell us about the policies and the relationships between residents and watershed managers in a way to better maybe effectuate better flood management and recovery? We also conducted some institutional analysis. So flood resilience and recovery requires participation from a lot of stakeholders, governments, private citizens, businesses. So how do these institutions complement or interfere with one another as they relate to flood resilience? And then finally, community resilience, the capacity for a community to recover, adapt, and prepare for future disaster. And this involves assessing indicators of resilient communities and comparing them with the Coon Creek watershed to identify capacities and vulnerabilities of resilience. So all of these additional project categories will be included in the report that we're working on now and should be out in a couple months. Just wanted to give one more shout out to those we worked with over the past 2 years. Monroe, Crosse, and Vernon counties were great collaborators with us. Dr. Eric Booth, our technical advisory committee, and then a few others both in Madison and out in the watershed that really helped us move this project along over the last 2 years. So with that, I will open it up for any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. That's okay.
Thanks, Rachel and Jackson. We do have one question, and I encourage anyone who has any questions for either speaker. We could look at them right now. Any discussion of review of cover crops in this area? I'm not entirely sure. Like what types of crops, perhaps?
Rachel, do you want to touch on that? Or?
Yeah, we the cover crops that were kind of in the area. I mean, we've got alfalfa, hay, and sorts of things like that. I'm not kind of sure what the question is sort of asking.
I know that cover crops are not simply not as popular in the driftless area as they might be. I kind of come from a background in Northeast Wisconsin, and I would imagine that the contour strip cropping is kind of a little bit more popular in the driftless area, at least in the Coon Creek watershed, as we found. So.
Okay. Well, that's all we get right now for questions. We still have a few more minutes. Anything else you'd like to add? Either of you?
I don't think so.
No.
We'll take the lack of questions as a sign that, as a good sign.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Jackson and Rachel and Carly for coming today and sharing your experience with us. Chad, I guess if we don't have any more questions, we can let people go to lunch early.
Never a bad thing to let people go to lunch early. So it looks like lunch runs 12:45 to 1:30, and then current sessions pick up right back up around 1:30 this afternoon. So thank you all. We are going to shut down the live stream, and
We did have one question come in. If you
all right, go for it.
Hold off. Trout fishing tourism is moderately important in that watershed. Do you know if existing trout populations at the time were wiped out because of the flood, or were the streams covered with sediment afterwards? Any idea on the impact on trout?
I do know that some of the streams, the banks were covered in sediment and kind of widened a lot more. I'm not sure the exact impact on trout, but I'm guessing it did impact it quite a bit. I'm not a trout fisherman, so.
Yeah. Fortunately, we can stock those back up pretty fast. So,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you.
Thanks.